Hello lovely people, pods. In this video we're going to start working with these pods and we're going to try to find out how pods affect the frequency response, the impedance graph of mid-range drivers, and what kind of performance we can expect from mid-ranges being in the pods. If you watch any of my previous videos, I did a full review of these pods from AliExpress that cost me very cheap, basically not like £15 or so. And I'm going to be using these as a temporary solution in my Skoda because I want something nice to be playing while I'm working on the dash, on the kicks, and on all the other stuff. So in this video, we'll be measuring performance of these drivers inside the pods. Now these drivers that I will be using, the first one is Museway MG3M, and the second one is going to be One Audio WB3.E, which is a wideband from One Audio. This is my favorite, probably favorite driver. And this might be my second favorite driver because it's playing very nice, it has very low distortion, and the price is like half of the One Audio. So these drivers are much cheaper. Now, why I'm testing these two? Because the One Audio is kind of normal driver. It has a cone, it has a surround, everything is like a typical normal mid-range driver. However, this one, the Museway, it has a face plug in the center, and the face plug is not connected to the cone. That means that when you have a pod like this is filled with hot glue from the inside, so there is no air escaping from it. And if I'm gonna push on the driver, you cannot see it, but air inside of the pod acts as an air spring, so you can feel it when you push it on the driver that the air doesn't come out anywhere. I have a thick gasket all around, so the air doesn't come out, and it is in a very small sealed enclosure. However, with this driver, it's not the case. There is an air gap between the coil and the pole, and the spider is not 100% airtight. So even if I'm gonna put this driver in the pod, just like that, and even if everything is airtight, I can very easily press on the cone because the air will be escaping from this. So I just want to see if there's going to be a big difference between the performance of these drivers. Now we know that when you put a driver in a small enclosure, the Q of the driver increases. So I will be measuring it. I have this, my DIY date and DATs with the audio interface. I will measure the impedance with the driver being outside of the pod, and then I'm gonna put it inside of the pod, and we will see how the FB, which is the resonant frequency of the enclosure, increases, and we can potentially spot any air leaks. So I'm hoping that with the Museway driver, we will see ripple in the impedance graph that will be caused by the air escaping through this, and with that one, the impedance graph should be very smooth. So we'll be measuring the impedance graph. Then I'm going to measure the frequency response in room in very similar conditions as I did with the tweeters when I'm going to put the pod over there on that pole. There are going to be some reflections, but not too many, and I'm going to be measuring about 1 meter distance. I do have all the data from the ultimate mid-range shootout for these, how they behave in a flat kind of infinite baffle application, open baffle application, and we will compare the responses. We will not look at the distortion. It's just a frequency response. And then I'm going to try to measure the frequency response in the car because I want to see which one will perform better in my case, because I want to use it as a wideband. Both of them I'm going to play up to 20K, but want to choose just one. And we will try to aim it and see how the performance changes. Obviously, they will need to be on axis as much as possible, but we will have a look at the response off axis as well in the car. So for the impedance, I will be measuring with the audio interface and my DIY rig. All the frequency response measurements will be done with the UMIC 2 measuring microphone, and for now it's going to be probably on deck power, but later on we're going to install the amplifier and we're going to tune it properly. So now I'm just going to take some measurements and we will see how these perform. Okay, so now I'm trying to measuring these inside of the car. So in the head unit, what I did, I went to whatever there is, this one, 4 channels, so front and rear. I did the fader all the way to the back, and I hijacked the signal from the back doors because I didn't want to go behind the head unit just for this testing, so I just hijacked the signal from there because it's 20/20 flat anyway, so it's totally fine. I'm playing pink noise, measuring with a Umic 2 as always in the listening position just like that, and I'm measuring in a few different places. So one place is over there as far as you can push into the corner, and for this one I measured it off axis and on axis, but the other speaker, this one, only on axis. I'm gonna tell you why. And then, so this is far because I just named the measurements like that. And the second measurement is a bit closer where I put the driver literally in this indent, so it stays there without me holding it. And on the driver's side, again, this is gonna be far measurement, which basically as far as possible. Then this one next to the grill is gonna be mid measurement, and this one I put close, like in this very, very corner, in case I would want to just literally clip it to the A pillar there. So yeah, just 3 measurements for both of these drivers, and the results are very surprising. So let's jump into the laptop and I'm gonna show you what I found. So let's start this with the impedance sweeps. I did these in the Ultimate Midrange Shootout. I just redid them again. The values are kind of the same with the one audio. We do see these little wiggles as mentioned previously. The FS now after them playing is 175. The Museway has a way lower FS of 95. So you can see that it's totally different driver, and one of the reasons why the difference in the sensitivity between these drivers, because the Museway has a much lower FS. It has a much softer suspension, and one audio, it's kind of a SQL driver as I mentioned before. So what happens when you put these drivers in the pods? One audio, this is in free air and this is in a pod. So in a pod we can see that the FS increases, FFB increases to 260, but these are not affected at all. So these wiggles, they stay the same, and we can see that there's no any additional wiggles. That means the pod is sealed and no air is escaping anywhere. We do have a little bit of a change here, and again, why? Maybe the surround that has a little bit of more pressure behind it. I don't know why, but in general, the FS increases and the Q of the driver changes. So I did manage to calculate from these measurements that one audio in free air has a Q of 0.56 and in a pod a Q of 0.9. So obviously the Q increases and we can expect a little bump at the lower end of the frequency response in the lower mid-range, and that's what we're going to see in the following measurements. The Museway, I did manage to calculate only the Q in the free air and not in the pod. So in the free air is 0.65, which is a bit higher than the one audio, so we can expect that in a pod the Museway will have a slightly higher Q, maybe 1 or maybe above 1. So Museway, free air, we don't see any wiggles or anything, very smooth impedance graph. In a pod, we see exactly the same. So I speculated that there might be another bump somewhere in the impedance graph due to the air escaping, but there's nothing, absolutely nothing. And the FB then increases up to 200 hertz. So again, a little bit lower than one audio, but the resonant frequency of the whole system increases and the Q increases as well. Now let's have a look at the frequency response. This is far field frequency response. So what I'm going to do is, I did in the beginning thought not to measure the distortion, but then I thought, let's have a look at the distortion as well. So this is the difference between one audio and the Museway measured far field from 1 meter distance. The biggest difference that we see, just ignore these wiggles because it's just reflections probably from the room and all over the place. What's more interesting for us is the actual trend. And for this we can see the difference is that one audio is the red one. It has kind of climbing level all the way up to like 16 kilohertz. But Museway has a flat response up to 4.7, then a dip, and only then it rises. So bear in mind this dip because this will show in the car as well. So this is the main difference. This is not crossovers. I put 300 hertz crossover as well, so it just chops off the bottom end. We're gonna have a look at the distortion as well. And as well, I took measurements near field, so right next to the actual cone. And we cannot see any differences, big differences between what I have in the pods and what I had in the ultimate mid-range shootout. Very, very similar responses. We have something happening here. I speculated this is due to the phase plug or the surround or something. This may be cone break, I'm not sure. But the main thing I want to point out is here. The difference is not that big, but we can say that one audio is a bit flatter in the lower frequency response. It doesn't have a massive bump, whereas relatively Museway from like 500 and down, it has this bump, which is higher than one audio. So one audio is a bit flatter in the pod compared to the Museway. Now let's have a look at the distortion. What happens when you put a driver in the pod? So this is one audio, and this is Museway in orange. This is with no crossovers applied. And we can see that the pod does indeed act as a cushion. The actual air inside acts as a cushion, and it doesn't let the driver to go out of control with the excursion. It kind of acts like, I want to say, like a shock absorber. And we can see that even with no crossovers applied, for example, one audio doesn't go above 1% all the way down to like 50 hertz or so, which is very impressive and very interesting. The Museway does go up to 2% at 200 and below. And again, this could be because the Museway has that air gap, that the air cushion inside is not as stiff because the air again comes in and comes out, whereas with one audio it's totally sealed. So it could be that. Now what happens if you apply a crossover? 300 hertz crossover for one audio, everything, all the distortion chops off, and what we have left is like down to 100 hertz, 0.2, 0.3%, very low distortion. These distortion numbers are going to be different compared to the ultimate mid-range shootout because I didn't check the level. I just literally did whatever. So the level was 85 decibels. Whereas in the mid-range shootout, I was aiming for 90 decibels. So the level is different. That's why the numbers look a little bit better. So this is before and after crossover. You can see that it chops off. But with a pod, you can put a lower crossover than you would if you would have a driver in open baffle, whereas in the dash. So you could have it 150 to 100 and it would still be kind of cool because this distortion just drops down. With the Museway, we have a similar situation where it just removes literally everything. I'm not sure why this peak appeared, just error in measurement probably, but everything, all of this distortion just goes down. So with the crossovers, both of these drivers, you can see the difference is minimal. Again, just ignore this peak, but we're talking about the difference of 0.1% distortion. One is 0.1, one is 0.2, but very close. So again, you could cross them lower. You can cross them 200, maybe 150, and it would still do good just because of that air cushion that the pod gives the driver. So again, I'm going to repeat myself that in pods, the driver can be crossed lower than normally, and the distortion will still be in control. So now let's have a look at the frequency response in car. So I have all of these measurements. Let's start with the Museway. So this is the Museway on the right side, which is the driver's side, pushed as far as possible into the corner. And in exactly the same location, this is one audio. You can see the difference is sensitivity, because one audio is much more sensitive compared to the Museway driver. So let's pull it a little bit down just to see the difference between these two drivers in the same location. I will try to align it something like this, yeah, in this area, because now the difference that we can see is, again, one audio has that rising top end, exactly as we saw in here, far field response. So like from 3K, One Audio has a bit more top end, and we can see here exactly the same from 3K, more top end, and the difference here in the lower, this is with no crossovers applied. This is exactly the same difference as I showed you here in the near field, where I said that One Audio is a bit smoother at the lower end, and Museway has a little bump. So exactly that we can see here. The Museway has a bump in the frequency response, and the One Audio is much smoother and much flatter. If we have a look at this, One Audio in this pod, if we're gonna draw a line here, we can say if we ignore this little dip at 2K, from 160 hertz all the way up to 10K is plus minus 3 decibels because this 5 dB scale. So it's a bit over and a bit lower. So plus minus 3 dB between 160 and 10K, which is just ridiculous how smooth this driver works with no EQ. If we compare this to the Museway will need some work done with it, especially boosting this area, exactly the same where we saw in here in the far field where I said there is a scoop out at about what, 6.5K, something like this. So yeah, 6.5K, we have a scoop out here, and this bottom end would need taming either with a crossover or with EQ. But if we compare just these two drivers, One Audio is much smoother. Now let's have a look at the differences between the actual locations. So this is, again, as mentioned, pushed as far as possible to the windshield. Yes, all of these are just reflections and peaks and dips, so because it's not optimal location again. If I pull the driver a little bit closer to me, this is again on the driver's side, there's not a bigger difference. The biggest difference is just probably some reflections that are slightly different. And then the third location, close to the sail, I want to say this is maybe the smoothest with least big dips and peaks. Yeah, this looks much nicer, and the location is kind of good. It is in the very corner, there's no reflective surfaces. So yeah, and again, this dip is not nice. If we compare this one with One Audio, again, the level is very different, but the response, this one has for some reason a scoop out at 1 to 2K, where the Museway didn't really have it. But yeah, there is a slight difference between these three measurements, but not that big. The biggest difference, we can say maybe from 400 to 3K, all of this. The bottom end is kind of the same, and the very top end, because these drivers are beaming probably from like 4 5K, so when they're beaming, it doesn't really matter what is around them. If you have any reflective surface or anything, it doesn't affect anything because it just plays straight into your ear. And here, all the reflections are coming into play. So this is the right side where we have on the driver's side. Now the left side is on the passenger side. We have this far and this mid, which is, it doesn't change much, maybe like in this area a little bit. What we can see here is next to the windshield, very far away, we have this dip at 730. I did have very similar situation in the Honda Jazz with the dome mid-ranges. I think that dip was a bit lower, probably like 600 hertz, I don't remember, but this dip, I would imagine, it's due to reflection either from the windshield, either from the passenger side door window. If I move the driver just a tiny bit forward, see, this reflection shifts in frequency and it's going a little bit lower. So that means that, now think. Lower frequency means longer wavelengths. That means that my guess this is a reflection from the windshield, because when I pull it towards the cabin, there's a bigger difference between the driver and the windshield, and that's why the reflection is in the lower frequency. But in general, it's not bad. It's not a bad response at all. Now, if we compare Museway versus One Audio, again, One Audio is just ridiculous how much level it has. But if we have a look only at One Audio, this is a super smooth response. So this is pushed close to the windshield, and this is pulled a little bit closer. And yeah, again, same situation. We have this dip changing frequency, and we have it like this. But in general, this response is very, very smooth. Look, you draw a line here, again, plus minus 4 dB up and down. Just this top end needs taming. And that's why for this driver, what I did, I pushed it close to the windshield and I turned it off axis. So off axis, it was looking at the passenger headrest. And the situation is this. So all this top end obviously went down. And from the driver's side, now this response is much smoother. This is very, very fatiguing peak. This is a cone breakup. It's very fatiguing, so it will need taming. But in general, it's a very nice response, especially at the bottom end. So the biggest difference between these two drivers is that One Audio doesn't really have that massive peak that is kind of a characteristic of a pod, whereas Museway, it does have it. So again, let's just move this a bit. There we go, just to even out. So the difference in sensitivity, the One Audio is about 7 dB more sensitive compared to the Museway. And again, it has more top end and less bottom end. So Museway in this little pod, I think it has a very high Q, probably above 1. Whereas One Audio in a pod, it doesn't have a peak, which is very surprising and very cool. So now you know, if you want a driver that sounds very good in a pod, not necessarily in a dash, One Audio is your choice. It's gonna sound much nicer with literally no processing, no EQ, no nothing. The only thing, it will need taming the top end. So either with a shelf filter or with EQ, just pull it down. So all of this told me that in my system, between these two drivers, I will choose One Audio for sure. Sensitivity, yes, it does play a role, but the main thing is that in a pod, I will need to use much less EQ to have a very nice frequency response. So these two drivers, yes. The Museway is a cool driver. It has low distortion, it has a very nice frequency response, but I think it would work better as a mid-range rather than a wideband, and it will work much better in an A-pillar or a dash rather than the pod. This driver in a pod acts as typically we see in the pod, with a bump in the lower end. However, this driver keeps surprising me. Like every time I do something with it, it surprises me. Like in a pod, it's very unusual that we would see that it wouldn't have any bump in the lower frequency response. I do think that Andy Wenmeyer mentioned that his AudioFrog drivers as well in a pod act very nice and don't have that bump. So this is very nice to see. But again, One Audio as a wideband is gonna go over there and over there, and now I just need to fix them somehow to the pillars. Very easy, just one bolt through the pillar and is going to be holding it in place. Very nice. But the other thing is that I need to power it. So with this thing, the problem with the head unit, there we go, with the crossovers, the problem is that you cannot cross the mid-bass drivers. You cannot chop off the top end low enough. So if I'm going to put the widebands on the rear channels, I can cross them like, see, 200. It's not granular, but I could cross them like 200 or something and it would be fine. However, for the front, if I would be using the mid basses, low pass, I cannot cross them lower than 4 kilohertz. So for a tweeter, if you would have a tweeter, you could use the rear channels for the tweeter. But for a wideband, the mid bass is going to play much higher than I need to. It's going to play all the way up to 4 kilohertz. And I would need it to play only up to like 300, 200 hertz. So that is out of the question. That's why the only time when I will be able to put these in is when I will have an amplifier and the DSP. So stay tuned for that. That is coming. First, I need to finish with the deadening and everything because, again, these doors are still not done. It was super, super cold outside, so I couldn't do anything. But then we're going to run the power wire. We're going to put the amplifier and DSP under the seat. And only then I will be able to run these. But I cannot wait. I really, really want these on the dash, at least temporary, because I really miss proper music. So that's it for now. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one.